My first job as a UX designer was vastly different from what I do today as a product designer. So I thought I'd share the differences between the two so that you can get a better understanding. And if you stick around long enough, I'm gonna go over the pros and cons of each so you can better figure out which one might be suited for you. As a heads up, I did split this video into twos because I realized while I was filming that I was getting pretty lengthy. So the video that you're watching now is part one, and it's going to focus on my role as a UX designer. Now, quick disclaimer, I'm not telling you this is exactly what's going to happen if you choose to work in either of these roles. And just remember that every role can be different based off of a lot of variables, like the organization itself and what they're needing within that job. Yeah, so just a reminder that this is really based off of my own personal experience, and per usual, don't come at me, bro. As my role as a UX designer, in this video, I'm gonna go over the setting, the types of people that I work with, the product, the types of assets that I worked on, and daily responsibilities as a UX designer. And if you need to skip around, feel free to use my timestamps below in the description, or I know YouTube's like putting them on the side, so they might be over here. But they might be over here. Let's first talk about the setting. So the setting can really influence the type of work that I'm doing and also the types of people that I'll be working with. For me in this UX design role, I was working at an agency. So I was working with a lot of different brands and I wasn't restricted to one industry. I worked on websites for shopping malls, hair tools, paddle boards, bicycles, real estate, and more. Now let's move on to the product itself, which I touched on a little bit, but I was mainly working on websites. Typically what would happen is a client would come to us as an agency to help either design their entire website or redesign a current website that they had. And once we hand off the final solution back to the client, then that project was closed and we would move on to another client project. Now, this is where I think you're gonna see the biggest distinction between product design and UX design, and I think that's the people that you work with. In this role as a UX designer working at an agency, I typically worked with the following: account managers in order to keep my project moving efficiently, branding and marketing to ensure that the brand strategy was communicated efficiently in the website, visual design. So that means art directors or graphic/visual designers to ensure that the wireframes and the mock-ups that I created made sense to them and that they were able to skin them correctly. The tech team, this is the digital director and any of the developers to ensure designs were executed correctly. And then we have the clients themselves. This is mainly during presentations or sometimes back and forth communication and revisions through the account manager. You can see that 30% is actually a pretty big chunk just to work with branding and marketing. And I think this is also a huge distinction between my job as a product design role, but basically the brand strategist would typically work with the client and come up with their mission statement, their values, the whole tone of the brand. And then I would come in and work with the branding team really closely to help them convey that vision digitally. For an example, if we had a brand who really wanted to highlight their customers, maybe I'd pitch something like a user-generated Instagram feed to really highlight their customers and the people that shop from their brand. All right, so let's move on to the types of assets that I was creating for this job as a UX designer. It's really all the typical kind of UX artifacts that you would find in a standard UX design job role. So we're talking research plans, tests and findings, sitemaps and user flows, wireframes, prototypes, and then we have presentation decks. Now, it's really important to include what I don't do, and that is visual design. After wireframing, I would then hand over those mock-ups to the graphic designer. Now, this graphic designer could either be working for the company itself, and they already have a bunch of brand assets that they typically use, and they're just going to place that over my wireframes, or we have a graphic designer that works inside the agency, and they've already worked with the art director and the brand strategist to come up with a brand style guide, which is like the color palette and the type and the imagery, and they're essentially placing that within the wireframes as well. Next, let's go over the types of day-to-day responsibilities that I had. I would say a good amount of my time is spent in meetings, and this could be internally with all the departments that I mentioned before, whether that's with account managers to make sure that, my deadlines are met and the project is going smoothly, or it could be with the tech team to ensure that all the technical requirements are met, or it could also be external. Given that this is at an agency, we are working with clients. So there's a lot of times where I have to present my designs to the clients, and there's a certain number of revisions for them to come back with feedback, and then for me to update the designs. And then the other big chunk of my daily responsibilities are being within that design process, like I mentioned, whether that's researching with participants and conducting user interviews, or synthesizing those findings and creating a presentation deck, or conceptualizing site maps and wireframes, and ultimately passing those designs to each of those stakeholders. Okay, now that you have a good overview about my role as a UX designer at an agency, let's go over the pros and cons. And let's start with the goodies first. Okay, so I will have to say, working at an agency as a UX designer is so fun because every day is different. You're working with different clients, you're working with a different industry, and you get to play around with designs, and then you kind of let it go, and then you start on a new thing. And as a new designer, I think it's a really great place to start because you get to figure out what industry kind of tickles your fancy and what you're more passionate about. And what's kind of cool too is if you are on a project where you're kind of like about, it does change in like a few weeks to a month, and then you kind of get a new one all over again. So I find it really fun, and it's like very challenging that way too when things are changing all the time and the problems and the client space is different. All right, so now let's talk about the cons. It's fast paced. In my personal experience working at agencies, I think that's just kind of agency life sometimes, where it's like very go, go, go. And some people love that, and I totally get it. It's way more fun that way, and you kind of get like an adrenaline rush working there, but I just couldn't keep up with the pace as a UX designer, especially when I wanted to take more time in certain parts of the design process. And there wasn't really much flexibility because you're working against a client deadline, and there's times where I found it really easy for myself to cut corners. And that goes into kind of like the second con, which is just those deadlines. And it's not only just like the deadlines themselves, but there's a lot of them, especially like at one point I was working with like 10 different clients, and you have to think about it. With 10 different clients, you have all those different presentations and revision rounds. And at some point it started feeling like I had like a deadline every other day. And again, that just kind of affected my design process in general on like where I wanted to take a bit more time on. And I felt like it wasn't really like a one size fits all process. Make sure you subscribe so you get notified when part 2 drops, which is going to be the video about my role as a product designer. But in the meantime, feel free to watch any of the other videos on my channel, which I'm going to put in my descriptions down below or wherever the descriptions live. And I will see you next time.